It is the morning of October 25th, 1917. A man in a long military coat sprints down the marble corridor of the Winter Palace, one of the most spectacular buildings on Earth, while gunshots echo somewhere in the streets beyond and an armed mob closes in on the gates. He has no army, no allies, no options left. He bursts through a side door, runs past terrified servants who had already started looting the wine cellars, and throws himself into the back of a waiting car. The flag flying on the hood of that car? American. He had personally borrowed it from the United States Embassy that morning, because by that point it was the only flag in Russia that could still get him through a checkpoint alive. That man was Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky, 36 years old, and 8 months earlier he had been the most powerful person in the largest country on Earth. The American press had called him the Russian Lincoln. He had taken Russia, a nation that had never, in 1,000 years of history, known a single day of real freedom, and turned it almost overnight into one of the most democratic countries on the planet. He had given women the vote before Britain did. He had freed every single political prisoner in the Russian Empire. He had abolished the death penalty. He had ended discrimination by religion and ethnicity with the stroke of a pen. And then he lost it all. Not to a foreign army, not to a queue by the old aristocracy. He lost it to a small, fanatical, almost laughably marginal party that most serious analysts in 1917 had written off as politically dead. He lost it to a man whose entire career had been launched decades earlier by a single piece of paper signed by Kerensky's own father. For 51 years after that morning, Kerensky lived as a quiet professor in California. His American neighbors had no idea that the courteous old man with the foreign accent, the one who bought his own groceries and walked his own dog, had once ruled 180 million people. He watched the Cold War unfold on his television set, a war that, if history had bent just slightly differently, might never have happened at all. This is the story of a man who tried to give Russia democracy and paid for that belief with his entire world. And the question his story leaves behind is one no democracy has ever fully answered. To understand how Kerensky lost Russia, you have to go back to a small, unremarkable provincial town on the banks of the Volga River, Simbirsk, population around 50,000, famous for nothing, remembered by no one. Except that this one obscure town produced two men who between them would reshape the entire 20th century. Alexander Kerensky was born there in 1881. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the man the world would later know as Lenin, was born there in 1870. Two boys, the same provincial backwater, 11 years apart. And here's what most history books skip. Their families knew each other. Kerensky's father, Fyodor Mikhailovich Kerensky, was the director of the men's gymnasium, the most prestigious school in Simbirsk. He was, by every account, a thoughtful and meticulously fair man. He believed deeply in education as a moral force. He believed that a child's worth was decided by their character and their work, not by who their relatives were. And that conviction would, decades later, destroy his own son. In 1887, when Vladimir Ulyanov was 17 and finishing at Fyodor Kerensky's gymnasium, Alexander Ulyanov, his older brother, was arrested in St. Petersburg. The charge was extraordinary. He and a small revolutionary cell had been caught with crude bombs intended for Tsar Alexander III. The plot was amateurish, sloppy, almost guaranteed to fail, but it didn't matter. The young man was tried, refused to ask for mercy, and hanged in May of that year. The reaction was instant. The entire Ulyanov family became socially radioactive. In Tsarist Russia, the family of a convicted terrorist wasn't just shamed, they were erased. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. Local officials stopped speaking to them. The widowed mother could barely receive visitors. And then there was the question of what would happen to 17-year-old Vladimir, the dead terrorist's younger brother, who was about to graduate. Fyodor Kerensky reviewed the boy's academic record. He saw the highest marks in the school. He saw a mind, frankly, that was probably the sharpest he had ever taught. And he made a decision that nobody else in his position would have made. He awarded young Vladimir the gymnasium's gold medal, the school's highest honor. He wrote him a personal letter of recommendation so glowing it was almost reckless, and he vouched for the boy in writing to Kazan University, where Vladimir Ulyanov would soon be admitted to the law faculty. Without that letter, without that medal, without that recommendation, the boy's career would have ended at 17. There would have been no Kazan University, no law degree, no revolutionary career. There would have been no Lenin. Sit with that for a moment. The father of the man who would one day try to save Russia personally signed the documents that launched the career of the man who would one day destroy him. This is not symbolism. This is not narrative invention. It is, almost unbearably, what literally happened. The Kerensky family believed that a young man should not be punished for the crimes of his brother, that fairness mattered even when it cost you something. This is the moral DNA of the entire Kerensky story. And it will be the exact thing that gets him killed politically 30 years later. Alexander Kerensky could have had a quiet, comfortable, lucrative life. He was brilliant. He was charming. He was, by every contemporary account, a devastating courtroom orator, the kind of lawyer who could make a jury cry, make a judge lose composure, and make hostile witnesses collapse under cross-examination. He had every conceivable advantage to build a prosperous legal practice serving wealthy clients and stay carefully out of politics. He chose, deliberately, to do the opposite. The Russia of the 1900s was a pressure cooker. The autocracy under Nicholas II was paranoid, corrupt, and increasingly violent. Jewish communities lived in fear of state-tolerated pogroms, organized mob attacks where police would arrive only after the killings were finished. Workers had no legal protections. Striking was effectively illegal. Newspapers that asked too many questions were shut down. Most lawyers with a conscience kept their heads down. It was the rational thing to do. Kerensky did the opposite. He sought out the cases nobody else would touch. He represented Jewish victims of pogroms when defending them was professionally suicidal. He defended Armenian revolutionaries on trial in 1912 in cases the government had effectively predetermined. He represented striking workers in trials staged for show. And in 1913, when the regime tried to scapegoat a Jewish factory worker named Mendel Bayless on a grotesque blood libel murder charge in Kiev, Kerensky publicly attacked the prosecution so aggressively that he himself was charged with libel and briefly disbarred. He was, in some ways, more dangerous to the autocracy than the actual revolutionaries. He was not trying to burn the system down. He was trying to make the system obey its own laws, and the system had no real answer to that. Then, in April 1912, came the moment that made him a national figure. In Bodaibo, deep in the Siberian wilderness, thousands of workers at the Lena goldfields, a British-owned gold mining concession, went on strike over disgusting food, 16-hour days, and brutal working conditions. The Tsarist government's solution was to send in troops. The troops opened fire on the unarmed workers. By the time the shooting stopped, more than 270 men were dead. The regime tried to bury the story. Kerensky personally led a Duma investigation. He traveled thousands of miles into the Siberian taiga. He collected witness statements, photographed evidence, interviewed survivors. He came back and delivered a speech in the State Duma, Russia's nascent parliament, so devastating it became national news. He didn't just denounce the massacre, he named officials. He laid out, with the precision of a prosecutor, the complete chain of command that had led to mass killing. By the time the February Revolution of 1917 swept away the Romanov dynasty, Alexander Kerensky was one of the most recognized political figures in Russia. He was about to be handed something nobody in 1,000 years of Russian history had ever held: a free country. February 1917. Bread riots in Petrograd spiral into mass demonstrations. The army garrison refuses to fire on civilians. Within 5 days, the Tsar abdicates. 304 years of Romanov rule, gone. Russia wakes up one morning in March without a Tsar, without a government, and without a plan. Two power centers emerge instantly. The Provisional Government, middle-class liberals, claims formal authority, but the actual workers and soldiers obey the Petrograd Soviet, a council of socialists meeting in the same building down the hall. Kerensky did something nobody else in Russia did. He joined both. He was Minister of Justice in the Provisional Government and simultaneously vice chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. He was the only living human being who held real power in both halves of the new Russian state. And he used that double authority to move with breathtaking speed. In a matter of weeks, his government did things most democracies had taken generations to accomplish. Full freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the death penalty abolished. Every political prisoner in Russia, including violent radicals, freed and released. Women given full political equality and the right to vote. Before Britain, before the United States. Discrimination by religion and nationality outlawed overnight. The Pale of Settlement that had confined Russian Jews for over a century, gone. By the standards of 1917, Russia under Kerensky became on paper the freest country on earth. Western capitals went wild. American newspapers ran adoring profiles. President Woodrow Wilson personally praised him. The United States became the first country in the world to officially recognize the Provisional Government. American loans started flowing in. There was a genuine, widespread belief in Washington and London that Russia had, in a single spring, joined the family of liberal democracies. For about 3 months in 1917, Alexander Kerensky was arguably the most celebrated political figure on earth. And then, the war got in the way. Here is what you have to understand about World War I, and what most people watching it from a distance never quite grasped. By 1917, Russia had lost more men than any other nation involved. Millions dead, millions more wounded, missing, or captured. The Russian peasant soldier had been thrown into modern industrial warfare with rifles that didn't fire, with boots that didn't fit, with officers who saw him as livestock. He had been ordered to charge German machine guns with bayonets. He had stopped, somewhere around the second winter, fundamentally believing in the war. Lenin understood this with cold, surgical clarity. His entire political strategy after returning to Russia in April 1917, famously in a sealed train provided by Germany, rested on a single promise: immediate peace. Stop the war, come home, take the land. It was a 4-word program, and it was exactly what millions of exhausted, starving, frost-bitten soldiers wanted to hear. Kerensky could have made the same promise. He could have opened separate negotiations with Germany, pulled Russia out of the war on almost any terms, and consolidated power on a wave of pure national relief. It was the politically obvious move. It would have saved his government. He refused. And here is the part of the story that is genuinely hard to fit into modern political logic. He didn't refuse because of stupidity. He didn't refuse because he didn't understand the situation. He refused because Britain, France, and the United States were Russia's allies. Russian soldiers had died for them. Western governments had given Russia loans and weapons. The new democratic Russia, the country he was trying to build, could not, he believed, begin its existence as a free nation with an act of national betrayal. He had given his word to the Western democracies. He intended to honor it. So instead of promising peace, he did the unthinkable. In June 1917, he ordered a new offensive. The Russian army, half mutinous, exhausted, in some sectors already operating soldier-elected committees, was thrown one more time at German and Austrian positions in Galicia. The Kerensky Offensive, the world called it. Under the famous General Brusilov, the army at first made real progress, pushed 20 miles forward, captured tens of thousands of prisoners. Kerensky himself traveled to the front. He gave speeches that contemporaries described as almost hypnotic. He stood in the open, in the rain, in front of soldiers who had not eaten in days, and told them in a high, strained, electric voice that the honor of the new free Russia depended on them. For about 10 days, it worked. Then it collapsed. The German counterattack was devastating. Entire Russian regiments mutinied. Some shot their officers. Some simply walked away from the lines and started the long march home. By August, the Russian army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, and the soldiers who had cheered Kerensky's speeches a few weeks earlier now hated him as the man who had sent them to die for foreign allies they had never met. He had gambled his political life on honor, and it turned out honor was not a currency the trenches would accept. By August 1917, Kerensky was politically wounded but still in power. He had become prime minister. He had moved into the Winter Palace itself. And then came the moment that, more than any other, historians point to as his fatal mistake, the moment he handed his enemies the weapon they would use to kill him. The commander-in-chief of the Russian army was General Lav Kornilov, a hardened, no-nonsense Cossack officer with the face of a man who had seen too much. Kornilov was not interested in democracy. He was interested in stopping Russia from falling apart. He believed the army needed discipline restored. He believed the Bolshevik agitators in the rear had to be hanged. And in late August 1917, he started moving troops toward Petrograd. What exactly Kornilov intended is, to this day, debated by historians. Was it a full military coup against Kerensky? A negotiated power-sharing arrangement that fell apart through miscommunication? A misunderstanding engineered by a politically clumsy intermediary named Vladimir Lenin, who shuttled between Kornilov and Kerensky, carrying different messages to each? We will probably never fully know. What we know is what Kerensky believed. He believed his own commander-in-chief was marching on the capital to overthrow the government and install a military dictatorship, and Kerensky panicked. He had no reliable troops of his own. The regular army was politically toxic. The garrison units in Petrograd would obey whoever paid them last. He needed armed fighters immediately, on the streets, in numbers large enough to stop Kornilov's advancing divisions. So he turned to the only people who would still fight. He opened the arsenals of the city. He distributed approximately 40,000 rifles to armed workers' militias, including, most catastrophically, the Red Guards of the Bolshevik Party, the same party whose leadership he had been trying to arrest just 6 weeks earlier, the same party whose leader, Lenin, was currently hiding in Finland after Kerensky's own government had issued a warrant for his arrest. Think about the psychological logic. Kerensky was so afraid of a right-wing military dictatorship that he chose to arm the far-left fanatics he had been fighting all summer. He chose the threat he understood, a general with cannons, over the threat he underestimated, ideological revolutionaries with a plan. Kornilov's advance collapsed before any real fighting happened. His troops were met by Bolshevik agitators in the railway junctions on the way to the capital, who simply talked them out of advancing. The crisis evaporated. But the rifles never came back. The Bolsheviks kept every single one, and now, for the first time in their history, they had actual military force to match their political ambitions. Kerensky had personally armed the revolution that would, 2 months later, sweep him away. The Democrat had armed the autocrats he was trying to prevent, because he was more frightened of one extreme than of the other. And the army officers who had supported Kornilov, the only force in Russia that might have defended the provisional government in October, would never trust Kerensky again. He had betrayed their general to save democracy. They would not save him in return. October 25, 1917. By the standards of revolutions, what happened next was almost ridiculously efficient. Bolshevik units, operating under instructions from Lenin and a man named Leon Trotsky, began seizing infrastructure across Petrograd through the night. Telegraph offices, train stations, bridges, government banks, the state telephone exchange. It was less a popular uprising than a hostile takeover, executed by a few thousand armed men against a state that had effectively stopped defending itself. The Winter Palace, seat of the Provisional Government, was surrounded. Inside the palace that night, a skeleton crew of defenders, a few hundred officer cadets from the military schools, a unit of Cossacks, a small detachment of disabled veterans, and a women's battalion, the Battalion of Death, that had been formed earlier in the year as a desperate attempt to shame male soldiers into fighting. There were no reinforcements coming. Kerensky had spent the previous days desperately phoning generals, sending telegrams, summoning loyal troops. Nobody came. The army he had pushed into a suicidal offensive to please foreign allies, the officers whose general he had betrayed in August, the soldiers who hadn't been paid, the regiments that wanted to go home, they all looked the other way. He left the city in the morning, hours before the palace itself was stormed. The car, a Pierce Arrow borrowed from a foreign embassy with an American flag mounted on the hood, drove through Bolshevik checkpoints that did not yet recognize the man in the back seat. He was, for the moment, just another figure in the chaos. He would not give up immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, he would find a Cossack general named Krasnov with about 700 horsemen march on the capital, fight a brief battle at the Pulkovo Heights just outside Petrograd, and lose. After that, he would spend months in hiding inside Russia, moving from safe house to safe house, before being smuggled out through Murmansk to Britain in 1918. The man the American press had called the Russian Lincoln, the man who had been prime minister of 180 million people, left his country forever. He was 37 years old. He would live another 52 years. He would never go home. This is the part of the story almost nobody knows. Kerensky lived in Paris through the 1920s and 1930s, writing, organizing émigré opposition to the Soviet regime, watching from a distance as Stalin systematically murdered nearly every old Bolshevik he had once known by name. When Nazi Germany invaded France in 1940, he fled again, this time to the United States. He spent the rest of his life there, most of it teaching at Stanford University in California, where he worked in the Hoover Institution archives, one of the largest collections of Russian Revolution documents in the world. Many of those documents were his own. He had carried them out of Russia in 1918 in suitcases. He gave lectures, he wrote books, he edited massive document collections that scholars still use today. He published a memoir with a title that gives away the entire ache of his late life, Russia and History's Turning Point. He sat for interviews. He watched on the television in his California living room the Cold War he had failed to prevent expand across half the planet, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Korea, Vietnam, all of it. Tens of millions of people dead from a system that traced through one straight line back to a man whose career his father had once saved. His American neighbors had no idea who he was. He was the quiet professor, the polite old man with the European accent. He bought his own groceries. He took walks. The man who ruled 180 million people stood in line at the supermarket. In 1968, when Kerensky was 87 years old, a journalist sat him down and asked the question, the one anyone who has lived through history like his eventually has to answer. If you could go back, if you could change one thing, what would it be? This was a lawyer asking, a man who had built his entire identity on the defense of legal process, a man who had spent his youth defending pogrom victims and traveling thousands of miles into Siberia to collect evidence of state violence, a man whose lifelong faith had been in the rule of law as a moral absolute. He answered without hesitation, I would have had Lenin shot. Not arrested, not exiled, not put on trial, shot. 50 years of watching what Lenin's revolution actually produced: the gulags, the famines, the show trials, the millions dead, the Cold War, the missiles aimed at his American living room, Korea, Vietnam, all of it. Tens of millions of people dead from a system that traced through one straight line back to a man whose career his father had once saved. He answered without hesitation, "I would have had Lenin shot." Not arrested, not exiled, not put on trial, shot. 50 years of watching what Lenin's revolution actually produced: the gulags, the famines, the show trials, the millions dead, the Cold War, the missiles aimed at his American living room, Korea, Vietnam, all of it. Tens of millions of people dead from a system that traced through one straight line back to a man whose career his father had once saved. He died on June 11th, 1970, in New York City. He was 89 years old. He had outlived Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and Khrushchev. He had outlived almost everyone who had ever been in the room with him during the events of 1917. There is one final bitter detail. When he died, the Russian Orthodox Church in New York refused to bury him. They held him personally responsible, half a century later, for Russia falling to communism. His body was flown across the Atlantic to London to a non-denominational cemetery. Even in death, he could not go home. Here is what Alexander Kerensky's story is actually about. It is not a simple story about a good man who lost to bad men. That would be far too easy and far too clean. The truth is harder and considerably more disturbing. Kerensky lost because he played by the rules of a game his opponents had already decided not to play. He honored alliance commitments, while his enemies made promises they never intended to keep. He defended the legal rights of the very people who were openly using those rights to dismantle the system that protected them. He armed his enemies to stop a military coup, and in doing so, handed them the rifles they used to stage a different coup 2 months later. He refused to become a dictator on principle, and his refusal made the eventual dictator far worse than anything he himself could have been. Every single one of those decisions was, taken in isolation, defensible, honorable even. Some of them were genuinely admirable. The cumulative effect was catastrophe, a catastrophe whose body count, depending on how you measure, runs to somewhere between 20 and 100 million human beings over the next 70 years. The question his story leaves you with is not a comfortable one. What is the limit of principled restraint? At what point does the commitment to playing by the rules become the mechanism of your own destruction? Can a democracy actually defend itself against people who treat democracy as a temporary inconvenience on the road to absolute power? Kerensky never fully found the answer. By the time he finally said it out loud, sitting in a California living room, an old man watching the Cold War on his television, it was 50 years too late. But the question itself, that specific question, has never, in the history of the world, gone away. It is being asked right now in democracies on every continent, and nobody has ever really answered it. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, hit subscribe. Every week on Tsars and Soviets, we dig up the forgotten people and the buried decisions that actually shaped the modern world. The history you weren't taught in school, the choices that still echo today. We'll see you in the next one.